Good evening. Good evening, gentlemen. Very exciting night tonight in Thursday night Chassidus class. We are beginning the second chapter of Likutei Amarim Tanya, of the Tanya of the Alter Rebbe, chapter 2. Chapter 1, ideally, this class is probably too slow to do it in an efficient way, but ideally, as you learn through the Tanya, you should try and make a mnemonic or try to memorize very briefly what each chapter is about. It's very helpful because then a person knows where to reference and where to go, right? So the first chapter of Tanya you could sum up in one word, right? And the one word is Nefesh HaBahamis, which means animal soul. The first chapter of Tanya the first chapter we just finished reading was about the first soul in a Jew, the first nefesh that a Jew has, which is called the Nefesh HaBahamis, or the Nefesh HaTivis, the animal soul, the biological soul, the natural soul, or the human soul in the Jew, depending how you define it. Of course, animal doesn't mean cats and dogs. Animal means the human animal, right? So you can call it the human soul as well. In any case, we discussed in the previous chapter, in all our previous classes leading up to this one, that the first soul of a Jew comes from what's called the Klipa and Sitra Achra. It comes from the peel on the other side, which means that God conceals himself to create a divine life force that says, I am. Not I am, God is speaking. I am, something else is speaking, right? I am as an independent being, so to speak. This divine life force, this divine I am, this self that God creates that is separate from him, covers over godliness, covers over the truth that really only God is the only real I am. The only true and justified I am is God. The only one who can really say that is God. God conceals this fact to allow and to bring forth all the finite, all the limited I ams. And these spiritual I ams, this goddess, God saying I am, but not as God, as someone else, right? If you follow that, this is the spiritual life force of the Jew. It gives life to the Jew's body, biological life. It encloses within his very blood, the heat of his blood, as we discussed, right? This is the life force which becomes one with the body to make one living human being. This soul is also the source of good and bad natural character traits in the Jew, as we explained, because I am is really a neutral statement. I am could be I am sad, I am angry, I am arrogant, or it could be I am merciful, I am bashful, I'm kind, right? I am can be pulled in either direction, which is when we made the critical separation, and spoiler alert, tonight we're going to discuss this, we're going to keep discussing it, we're going to discuss it until it's coming out of our ears, the difference between the existential good and evil, as we're calling it, which means unity with or separation from God, revealing the divine truth of all existence or concealing the divine truth of all existence, versus moral good and evil or emotional good and evil or good and evil character traits, right, which are really, in a sense, a related but mostly separate issue, separate but related. Right? So the animal soul, that's why the animal soul has both good and bad character traits by nature, inherently, because what we mean by good and bad is, in that case, is simply more self-centered or destructive or unhealthy versus other-centered, healthy, constructive, right? However you want to put it, right? That is the realm where things more or less make sense to us. That's the realm, as we discussed actually at the end of chapter 1, where non-Jews and Jews are very similar, right? So in other words, all of the, your BuzzFeed list of 8 tips for achieving true self-actualization and death of the ego in 2022, right, which applies to non-Jews and Jews equally if it worked. It would be the because both of them address the animal soul, which both non-Jews and Jews have. And this soul comes, as we discussed at the end of chapter 1, comes in Jews and the Chassidim Olam, the righteous among the nations, comes from Klippas Nega, comes from what's called the translucent Klippa, which means that it's I am, but I am is also open to the idea that God is, right? Which means essentially it's not truly in denial of God so much as it's neutral on the issue, right? Now, in truth, even as we discussed, even neutrality is a form of denial, because it's not really true. There is no such thing as objective reality as a baseline. There's only the divine reality as a baseline. So in a sense, to even declare I am, but maybe God is a denial of God entirely, which is why it's still called a klipa, which is why it's still called a shell, or something that covers over the divine truth, something that becomes a separate reality from the divine. Nevertheless, on the other hand, it's not as bad as the three impure klippas, which is the root, as we discussed last week at great length, of idolatry and by association all other evil, more or less, which says only I am, right? No room for God, no room for the divine reality, right? The total reorientation of all reality around the self, which is what's called the three impure klippas. These are the non-translucent klippas. The reality of God cannot enter, right, at the existential level, not consciously, right, but rather in what the very thing is. At its essence, it is a denial and opposition to godliness. That is chapter 1. So in short, chapter 1 is about the first soul of the Jew. Chapter 2, unsurprisingly, is about the second soul of the Jew. That's what chapter 2 is going to be about. Chapter 2, if chapter 1 is Nefesh HaBahamis, chapter 2 is Nefesh HaLekis, the divine soul, the godly soul of the Jew. And I have news for you, chapter 1 was much easier. Chapter 2 is going to require a bit more finesse and subtlety, because the animal soul is much more relatable, even in the way we explained it, which is in a very abstract and refined way, is much more relatable and understandable than what the divine soul is. The divine soul is like, as we're going to see, is like something from a different universe, and to relate to it and to even appreciate what it is going to require work from our end. So chapter 2 is going to be about what is the divine soul, and chapters 3, 4, and 5, in a sense, are going to be, when we get to them, is going to be an unpacking and unfolding of chapter 2. Chapter 3 is about the fundamental or more or less fixed faculties of the godly soul. Chapter 4 is about what's called the garments of the godly soul, which is thought, speech, and action, / mitzvahs. The two things go together. And chapter 5 is about learning Torah, which is also an aspect of the godly soul and what it means when the soul learns Torah, etc. And then only in chapter 6 and chapter 7 are we going to get back to our good old friend, the animal soul and the klipa and all the not nice things, so to speak. So for a while, it's all about holiness. Yes?
Sorry, quick question.
Please.
The non-Jew, but righteous of the nations, is studying Torah.
Yes.
What does that have anything? Does that do anything in that realm like that we're talking about right now, or is that second aspect of the soul, with the second soul, also completely absent, even if they are learning Torah?
No, that's a very interesting question. Really, the question belongs to chapter 6 and chapter 7, because there it talks explicitly about the difference between what it means to study wisdom in general. However, to answer your question on one foot, the answer is no. This soul that we're talking about is exclusively a Jewish soul, and it's not a question of capacity, it's a question of existential connection, as we're going to see. So in other words, a non-Jew and a Jew can understand an intellectual idea in Torah equally well. However, that has no bearing in the eyes of Chassidus on what it really means to study Torah. Right? There is an external aspect of Torah, so to speak, which becomes purely intellectual, to which everyone has access. And then there is the real purpose and the real goal of learning Torah, which is a different story, which is why in the Midrash, the famous statement of the Midrash, I believe on the Midrash Eicha, if I remember correctly, that the Midrash on Eicha, the Midrash Rabbi Eicha on Lamentations says that if someone tells you that there's wisdom among the nations, believe them. But if they tell you there's Torah among the nations, do not believe them. And we'll discuss later, when we discuss Chachmas Chitzonius, superficial wisdom, worldly wisdom, which is one of my favorite topics, by the way, we'll discuss what that means exactly and the distinction. But fundamentally, the short answer to your question is no. The godly soul that we're discussing is the possession only of the Jew, and it's as an inheritance. So think of it as a what we would nowadays call a genetic thing, although that doesn't really, that's kind of an insult. But in the sense of fundamental inheritance, which it is, as we're going to discuss, right? We get this because we are descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and why that would be and what that means, we'll get into all of that as we go through chapter 2. So, the beginning of chapter 2, however, I'll read the utmost extent of what we could possibly explain in tonight's class, which is, don't even bother getting a book if you don't have one. It is Perek Beis, chapter 2. It is actually one of the most shocking, uplifting, transcendent, foundational statements in the entire Torah, and emphasized in Chassidus to an incredible extent and made foundational. And that statement is, the nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael hi chelek eleika mimal mamash. The second soul in Israel is a piece of God above, literally. This is the famous first line of the second chapter of Tanya, and we are almost certainly not going to even finish what I want to say about it tonight. So we may continue with that next week. I don't know how much reading there'll be next week, but that is probably what we're reading this week. That's probably the extent of it. The second soul of the Jew is a piece of God above, literally. First of all, let's begin to sort of at least understand what the words mean as we get into it, right? The general gist is like this. Let's start with sort of the general thrust of the idea, and then we'll get into the individual words in this statement. The general thrust of this idea is that the Jew, in addition to the regular, vital, biological soul with which we are all familiar with day to day, the Jew possesses a second entire vitality, almost like an entire second person within them. And now we'll discuss as we go further. I'm not sure if in this chapter, perhaps in a later chapter, it depends how pressing the question becomes. We'll discuss why we don't experience this as being two people, because the truth is that this soul is so different from the animal soul that it really is literally, it's actually further away than two people with two different animal souls is one person's animal soul and godly soul. They're as different from each other as could possibly be imagined. So how they're even united in one experience of a self, like most Jews have, right, is itself a question. So we'll get into that, right? A Jew has almost an entire second being to his self. This second being to his self is literally a piece of God above. The simple reading of the word literally, which the Alter Rebbe puts in here, which we'll discuss where the sources are for this statement and how it was constructed by the Alter Rebbe, so to speak, from the sources, but the author of the Tanya, of course. The word literally here, the simple meaning, as all of the commentaries on Tanya say, is simply to convince you that it's not a guzma. That's the main reason it says literally. The word mamish, which means literally. The simple reason why the Alter Rebbe writes literally at the end of the sentence is because if he didn't, you would think he was exaggerating, because he's making such a radical statement. The radical statement is that this second being in yourself is literally a piece of God, right? Now, the immediate question most people have hearing this is, what does it mean that you can have a piece, right? Which we'll get into, that there can be a piece of God, which is something that we'll get into at length that you probably will not appreciate. You'll probably wish we didn't get into it by the end. But here's the gist. The gist is like this. If you take nothing else away, because we're gonna go deep into the weeds, but if you take nothing else away from tonight's class, yeah, the animal soul is I am, right? The godly soul is God saying I am, yeah? And the Jew is somehow both of these roped into and tied together, and it's like in a sack, as you'll see. That's not so far from the metaphors that the Alter Rebbe uses later when he talks about the war between the two souls, right? Which is in like chapter 9, so we don't even have to worry about that. But the these two fundamentally opposed, two things could not be more oppositional if you imagined, right? Maybe if the animal soul was from the three impure klippas, it would be slightly more oppositional. But the bad news is, of course, that many Jews with an animal soul use their animal soul in a way that it becomes like the three impure klippas. So basically, it's a wash. You can't have two things that are more different than these two things. The animal soul, at its very core, is I am, and the I precludes God. It's a different I. It's other, right, from God. The godly soul is I am, and it's God saying it. Yes, that's really in a very non-rigorous level. We're going to get more rigorous to really try and understand what this means. But at a very non-rigorous, light, basic level, that's what the godly soul is. Now, what's interesting, I should just point out in this framing, is that really God says both, right? Because there's no one, like I said, in truth, there's no one else speaking, as the Tanya gets into much later. There is no real other voice. There's only one voice, right? So God says, I am, and that saying I am is the Jew twice. But one I am separates to become a total concealment of God and becomes a second pole on reality, right? Like imagine all of reality is two people facing each other, right? So you have the lower pole of this literally bipolar reality, right? You have the lower pole, the lower face, right? The lower self, which is experiencing reality, is God saying I am as a separate I. And then you have the godly soul of the Jew, which is God saying I am as himself, so to speak, right? Now, we're going to get into all of the details of what this is and why this is, but I would like to point out that it is God speaking to an extent in this metaphor. So in other words, there is godliness which transcends, so to speak, saying I am. Right? That God is saying I am and I am, but both of these are still saying. The metaphor is not exact, and it's my own, and even worse, it's my own metaphor, which means it's really can be totally thrown away and discarded. But this is, if you take nothing else away, at the simplest level, that is what we're saying. We're saying that a Jew is someone who has within them a complete spiritual being that is I am as a separate being from God, and a complete spiritual being which is I am, which is God saying I am. And both of these together are in each and every Jew, from Rasha to Tzaddik. Yes?
Is it okay to ask questions?
Yeah, please, go for it.
So I was reading about Moses and Jethro.
Yeah.
Jethro coming to them, and Moses, I believe, vowed to Jethro, or the one, I think Jethro vowed to Moses.
Yeah.
Or I think Moses vowed to him, but it was like this expression of Jethro being worldly wisdom, being
yes.
worldly wisdom,
right,
and Moses being of divine wisdom.
Yes.
But he was, the divinity, the divine needed to envelop, or that it was showing that it was part of, it was actually required to become within, like, enveloped.
Yes,
wisdom,
right, correct.
But so in the same way, it made me think immediately that this idea of, like, when we have this animal soul that is that says I am, but it's not really separate, but we have this I am that is the God, the peace
yes.
of God that does it envelop? Because it's really not separate. It thinks it's separate, but it's not separate because it's truly really God anyhow. And is it a consciousness problem, or that the I am that says I am that's separate doesn't realize that it's actually part of? Is it enveloped within the divine soul?
It's a very good question. The truth is that at this juncture, it's really beyond our pay grade. We are doing the basic building blocks. No, it's a very good question, and that's the immediate question someone would ask hearing this idea is how exactly do the two of these interact? But the truth is we're not ready for interaction because we don't know anything about it. So we're going to build up each side, and then later we're going to see how these two deal with each other, and also what the point is, and why did God make it this way, etc. We're going to get to all of that. So, but first things first. So that's the most general at tonight's class, right? Now I want to get very, very specific in this sentence. In this sentence, the second every single word of this sentence has commentary on it from all the commentators on the Tanya, right? Every word, precisely. The nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael, he chelek elokam imal mamish. Every word. The second soul in Israel is a part of God above, literally. Why second? We explained this already in the first chapter about the first soul. When we called the first soul, right? We said that this one is the second soul. Why second?
It comes in later.
Right. So the simple explanation is that the second soul enters the Jew later. Now, the truth is that the Jew always has a divine soul, of course, because the divine soul is, as we've just explained, is core to the very being and identity of the Jew, right? However, that soul does not yet fully enter into and become revealed as a real presence within the Jew until the Jew reaches the age of majority, right? Bar or bat mitzvah. Before bar or bat mitzvah, although every Jew has a divine soul, that divine soul is not really ready the battle is not joined yet. The divine soul is not really fully present as a competing self within the Jew, so to speak. Rather, it's in a process of entering, a process which we say really begins at bris, or the baby naming, at the circumcision, or the naming of the child, right? And that process continues through until bar mitzvah. And at bar mitzvah, the animal or bat mitzvah, the godly soul becomes fully revealed within the person. That's the simple reason why it's the second soul, right? There's deeper reasons, which mainly have to do with the idea that, in a sense, the entire reason the godly soul is even being discussed in Tanya is for the purposes of the animal soul, which kind of touches on Josh's question, which is that really the entire purpose is not the godly soul. The entire purpose is the conquering, transformation, training, education of the animal soul. So in a sense, it's not just second in time, it's also second, in a sense, in importance even. Because really the entire point, counterintuitively, is the animal soul, not the godly soul.
Why?
Because...
Why are we going to train the animal soul? And the animal soul, as we've said before, is just to certain functionality. That's a
very good question. That's a good question to have. You should remember that question always. You should say when you wake up in the morning. You should say before you go to sleep at night. Everyone hear Daryl's question. The question is, if the animal soul is so completely useless, so small and pathetic, and a separate, and a denial, it can't know the truth because its very existence is defined on a lie and a denial of the ultimate truth. So what do we need it for at all? That's a very good question. I like this question. This is a question we can verbrang, we can drink, we can sleep, we can wake up with it, we can pray with it. The answer to the question is, for some reason, God really enjoys that the animal soul should be involved as well. And in fact, if it wasn't for the animal soul, the godly soul would not descend to this world either. The divine soul is good up above. It doesn't need to be here. The only reason it's here is the transformation of the animal soul. And if you ask, but that seems very strange, the answer the Alter Rebbe would give you is, indeed, it is very strange. We do not understand everything that God likes, but this is what God likes. Of course, I'm being a bit flippant. There's a bit more to it than that. But that is the general gist. The general gist is that God desires that he should be revealed in a place that naturally denies him. That is his deepest and most profound desire. And therefore, the purpose is not the godly soul, which does not deny him at all. On the contrary, it is him. It's a piece of him, as we just said. His desire is to be revealed in the animal soul. A more interesting question, which is not more interesting, but a more pertinent question to our chapter, actually, if you think about it, is why would I need a godly soul to accomplish this task, right? And this question we've in a way already answered in chapter 1. You already know the answer to this question. Why do I need a godly soul to do this? Why can't the animal soul do it on its own? Right? And this is one of the questions that, as if by magic, we already know the answer to, because we already learned chapter 1. And in chapter 1, we learned that the animal soul is fundamentally an I am and cannot escape it. right? The only escape is really with the help of the godly soul. And when we say God wants to be known, right, we mean not just known as an idea, not just known intellectually, not just known morally, but to be revealed as he himself is, which means that you have to get rid of or tame or transform the I am of the animal soul into a God is, at least, right? But anyway, that's why it's the second soul. Now, part of God, this is the sticky point. And the truth is, it's not just sticking because of the question, it's really this part of the phrase, a part of God above, is really the pivotal, it's the core here. To understand what this means, is to understand the sentence, is to really understand what these words mean. Chelek Eloka Mimal, literally a part of God. The language Chelek Eloka Mimal, a part of God above, is from a verse. It's from a pasuk. The pasuk is in the book of Job, the book of Iyov, chapter 31, verse 2. You can go check it out. I have spoilers for you. If you go and look at it there, it is not talking about the soul at the simple level of the text at all. Chelek Eloka Mimal there means chelek, when we say a piece, we mean he is referring to the piece, meaning really not the piece, but the portion, right? Like we say in the morning, Asherenu Matayv Chelkenu, joy unto us, how good is our lot, right? And the same word, chelek, a part, right, which is a common translation of the word in the Holy Tongue. What Job is talking about there when he says chelek eloka mimal means the lot in life given to me by God above. That's the simple translation, as all the commentaries on that verse say. So in other words, you can go, that's the source for these words, but if you go and look at the verse there, you will not find any reference to the soul or anything like that at all, even though that's where the words come from. However, the soul is described with these words, Chelek Eloka Mimal, in a long, long heritage of Jewish sources. And among them, you have Kabbalistic sources. The Ramak says it in the Pardes, Rav Moshe Cordovero says Chelek Eloka Mimal about the soul. These are all places that use these words about the soul, right? The Ramak says it in the Sefer Pardes. The Arizal says it in Sharuch HaKodesh. The Shefatal famously doesn't just say Chelek Eloka Mimal, he even says Chelek Eloka Mimal Mamish, which is the first place that this whole phrase of the Alter Rebbe's appears, is in the Sefer Shefatal, which is by a student of Rav Moshe Cordovero. Right? So this whole phrase, what's his name? I'm not sure, but his Sefer is the Shefatal. This phraseology is found in the Holy Shalah, the Shneur Chesabris. It's found in the Yosher Levav, which is written by the Baal Mishnas Chassidim. It's found in Yares Dvash. It's found in Ur HaChaim on the first pasuk of Bereshis, which is very, very long. But if you read the whole thing, you'll see in there that he refers to the neshama as Chelek Eloka Mimal. Yeah. So in other words, these are all Kabbalistic sources preceding the Alter Rebbe, which all discuss the soul being a piece of God above. And in fact, contrary to perhaps common misconception, you can find the exact same descriptions as well in Nigla de Torah. It's not only Kabbalistic. You can find in non-Kabbalah works as well. For example, the Maharsha, the Pnei Yeshua, and the Malbim, for example, all non-Kabbalistic works, all discuss the soul as a piece of God above. So in other words, although the verse is not at the simple level, at the level of Pshat, discussing the soul when it says a piece of God above, however, that this is a description of the soul is a very old and very robust lineage. This is not an original idea or an original phrasing from the Alter Rebbe. This goes way back, yeah.
It does seem that, like you were saying, the way that we have it, though, it's like this inheritance, and the way interpreters describe it a lot.
That's true. Very good, very good. I like that. I like that. Excellent connection. I hadn't even thought of that. Very good. It's like a lot in life. A chelek as an inheritance. Very good. Yeah, that is a connection. Absolutely. the entire Chassidus depends on this idea that the soul is a piece of God, right? I already explained one reason why. One reason why, as I already explained, is because you can't escape the animal soul being an animal soul without the help of the godly soul, at the simplest level, right? We already touched on that in this class. But it's much deeper. It's much deeper than that, because the truth is, there's almost no discussion of practical Chassidus or Chassidic philosophy that can work, that makes any sense, or that functions without basis in this idea that the godly soul is a piece of God, right? What's the idea broadly, right? We'll get back to what it means a piece. I haven't forgotten about it. What does it mean broadly? Like I said before, one soul of the Jew is God saying, I am. But what does that mean? When two finite beings relate, and really it could be anything. It could be me and this coffee cup. In a way, it could even be me and you, although as we'll see in the 32nd chapter of Tanya, it's not really so. But theoretically, it could be me and you. When two finite beings that are creations within the world, that God creates as separate beings from godliness, when they relate in objective reality, right? How do they relate? They relate as I am to I am. That's how they relate, which is a different way of saying they relate from the outside, right? What do I mean by from the outside? What I mean is that if I already was this coffee, if I knew this coffee cup from the inside, I would be this coffee cup, so to speak, right? In other words, what do I mean by that? Because that's very, I don't know what the word is. That's very way out, man.
External.
Yeah, well, physically, of course, external, but it's even more profound, right? Because the coffee cup is not just physical. In fact, as we already discussed in this class on Tanya already, right? There is nothing that's just physical. Everything is physical and spiritual together. Everything is body and soul together. But so when you're relating to this thing, it has an essential core nature that makes it what it is, if it's anything, right? And that core nature is different than yours by definition. Because if it was the same as yours, right, you would be one thing. The very fact that you're two different things, right, and that starts as two core I ams, which are basically more or less featureless. They start as undefined I ams, two separate ones, right, and then they build outward with their natures. So I get flesh and blood, whereas this coffee cup gets metal, and I'm pink and it's black, and so to speak, we relate this way. And I, of course, am from the Mina Medaber. I'm from the category of the human, whereas this is from the category of the Doimim, the silent or the inanimate, right? So we have totally different natures, and those natures build out one to one another. Now, if I want to have a relationship with this thing, these two I ams have to interact, right, at whatever layers. And sometimes you can peel back the layers quite far. Maybe not so much with a human being and a coffee cup, but with two people, right, who have many more layers and much more spiritual complexity than a coffee cup does, right? You relate to each other from the outside. You start at the most superficial layer of the barest social contact, right? And you can go inward and inward and inward, theoretically almost without limit, right? You can go deeper and deeper and deeper into a interrelation, right? But what is this relation? This relation is two selves, two separate selves, negotiating, right? Like I said, those two faces facing one another, right? They're negotiating a relationship. Now, if there is here's where it connects to Tanya. If there's no such thing as the idea of a chelek elokam mimal, the relationship of the Jew with God would be the same, right? There's me down here, I face up to God. God is up here, something else, definitely. He's much less like me than this coffee cup is, right? Because we ultimately are two finite beings, so the difference between us is in some sense finite. Whereas God, as an infinite, incommensurately greater being, right, is immeasurably different from the both of us. Compared to God, me and the coffee cup are the same, right? In fact, much more. That's even underplaying it, but whatever, right? So there's me here below, there's God facing me from above. And somehow, right, there has to be some kind of, from the outside, you have to build this connection, right? And the fundamental point that we made in the first chapter of Tanya, we made it without even discussing it. We made, you know this already, but we didn't make it explicit, right? Which is going to be the nature of a lot of this Tanya class, because if we made everything explicit we were talking about, we would move even slower than we move already, right? Because God is a totalizing reality, because in truth there is nothing else other than God, in other words, because in truth all there is the reality of God, that means that as long as there's an I am, and there's God, they can move towards each other to some extent, right? You could say I am and God is as well, right? But true unity and true connection is impossible, right? Which is just a more emotional way of saying the same thing it says later in Tanya, which is that the finite and the infinite are an unbreachable gap. You can't, as a finite being, you can't climb up to the infinite, right? You never reach it. It's unreachable. That's what infinite means. Infinite means it's unreachable. Yeah? So you can move towards God and move towards God and move towards God, but there's never any actual connection, right? God is not attainable. It's like trying to grab the sky. It doesn't work, right? The closer you get, the further it gets. But the technical reason, or not even the technical, the deeper reason why that is, right? Because you could say, well, if it's infinite, maybe that means I grab a part of it, but I can't really grab all of it, or something like that, right? You could use different metaphors and try and sort of get around this issue. When you explain it as the I am of the Klippa versus the I am of God, you realize that these things are actually fundamentally irreconcilable, right? They can't both be true. One of us is right and one of us is wrong. Something has to give, right? And when we say give, we don't mean
Totally.
we don't mean agree on some kind of compromise, right? Because, as we already explained, as you already know, the I am is the entire basis of the animal soul's being, right? You can't compromise on I am. If you compromise on I am, you don't exist anymore. Yeah? The basis of existence is I am. And so too, what? Right, to not exist anymore, right? Unravel the I am. It's not so simple. It's not so simple. In fact, in the eyes of Chassidus, we probably say it's more difficult than most people would think it's more difficult. We say that what some people think is the unraveling of the I am is not an unraveling of the I am at all. And it has to do with our conception of God, all of which we'll get to, right? If you have a lower conception of God than Chassidus does, which Chassidus has the most radically insane conception of God possible, really, in the positive sense. In the positive sense of insane, l'mayla min haseichel, above super rational is what I mean by insane. Insane in a good way. Then it's really truly irreconcilable. If you have a lower conception of God, which we'll get to actually not so far from now. Actually, in chapter 2, we'll probably get back to this idea that if you have a lower conception of God, it's more reconcilable. But because once you really understand what the Torah says God is, right, the I am cannot be unraveled from the inside. It's impossible. What the I am thinks is the unraveling of the ego, like I was saying, like you learned on BuzzFeed, is not really is not so. It's not so. That's a different discussion for a different time. But generally, you're right. Generally, the goal should be, right, the totally unraveling of the self. The problem is that this is akin to self-destruction, and the animal soul cannot actually do this form of self-destruction. So, for reasons we'll get into later. So what are you left with? What are you left with? If there's no godly soul, all relations with God would be incomplete, and they would be from the outside. And even if you could partially get rid of that I am, which I would agree you could, there's many, many levels in that spectrum, right? No getting rid of I am is a vessel for the true reality of God. Because it's how big a vessel do you need for the truly infinite? And the answer is you need no vessel, right? So it doesn't help to partially get rid of a vessel, to get rid of the I am, right? So assuming, following me so far, there really is very little hope of making a finite, piecewise relationship with God. And piecewise, I mean piecewise, P-I-E-C-E, right? Step by step. There's no process that reaches God in Chassidus. There's no argument that reaches God. God is not the conclusion of any intellectual journey. God is something that's truly, truly transcendent. And by definition, the finite and the animal soul can't reach him. Enters into the picture the godly soul. The godly soul is the key, right? It's the key to everything. The question that you come to the Alter Rebbe asking, the reason the Alter Rebbe is writing Tanya, the question he's answering that you asked him, as we discussed in earlier classes, the question you're asking is, how can I have a more godly Judaism, right? The person who's coming to the Alter Rebbe keeps the laws, he studies Torah. The problem is that where's the real love and fear of God in a complete way? Where's the real love and fear? Where's the true relationship with God? I can keep all the laws, I can learn all the Torah, but still, I feel like I'm so far. I feel like there's no real connection, right? The answer, the pillar, the basis, the foundation of the answer of the Alter Rebbe is you already possess an infinite connection with God. That's the answer. The answer is you cannot achieve a connection with God. But the good news is you don't need to achieve it because you already possess it, right? In other words, what? You got what you're going to get, but what you have is an infinite connection with God, by definition. That's the answer to the Jew. The Jew has an infinite relationship with God in a godly soul, by definition, inherently. And not just the holy Jews, every single Jew, by definition of what they are, as an inheritance from their holy forebears, right? As what God has given you, he gives it to you with his expectations that he has of Jews. They come as a package deal. I have these expectations, and here's the soul you're going to use to fulfill it. The two things come together.
Can you describe or talk about, if maybe you already are, you talk about separate the relationship with finite, and we discussed that a little bit. But the godly soul is from within.
Yeah.
And what's that? So can we is there any way to contrast that? How does that exist?
Instead of face to face, there's only one perspective on the universe. The universe curls, everything curls around and comes back in, so to speak, right? It's a very physical and coarse metaphor. But as opposed to face, right? As opposed to two ends working towards each other, right? There really is, from the godly soul's perspective, there's only one perspective on reality. There aren't two perspectives. There's only one perspective on reality. Why even have an external reality then, right? The external reality is just the external expression. It's the place of, it's the how would you put it? It's like it's the park where you go for a stroll with God, so to speak, right? In other words, the external reality exists fundamentally as a meeting place, right? It's for God to meet with himself, whatever that means, right? The godly soul and God really look out at the universe with the same eyes. There's really only one perspective, right? Or to put it slightly differently, if you have a visual way of thinking of things like I do, it can be somewhat helpful. Just don't get too caught up in the pictures because they're all very coarse and there's no real depth to them, but it can still be nice to help clarify what you know already. So if you have two faces facing one another, right, you have to think that within the lower face, at the inside, right, it actually all bends around like a weird what do they call it? Like a fisheye lens almost, right? Where as you get to the edge of the picture, everything bends infinitely around into the circle, right? So it's almost like reality is like a fisheye lens at the core of the Jew, right? What does he have? He's not facing God from an infinite distance. On the contrary, he's actually it's all from within the one perspective of God. That's the godly soul. The godly soul is God saying, "I am." Again, that's the idea, right? Same idea. So the basis of the entire Chassidus, and really in the practical takeaway from this class, and maybe some of the coming classes as well, the practical takeaway, because we haven't even spoken about what the soul does or what the soul is for, the practical takeaway is very simple. The practical takeaway is that every single Jew, from the worst sinner to the most righteous person, has an equal, infinite, inherent connection with God. The Jew cannot truly become separate from God. As the Alter Rebbe says, it says in the Hayom that a Yid niter will niter ken sein abgerüstet unter Elikus, which means that a Jew does not want and cannot be separate from godliness. This truth can be covered over, but it can never be destroyed. And it can never be impurified either. This truth remains. Sorry?
What about karet?
No. Even kares, compared to the depth of this connection, the spirit kares is spiritual excision, right? The cutting off of the soul, so to speak. Right. Even that can't cut off the soul, because fundamentally, why not? How do you have to think about it? Because you think if you're kares, what? You can't destroy God. Very well. Very good. Or a slightly different way of putting it is you can't separate a thing from itself. It's not like you're connected with a rope, right? Now, later in Tanya, for example, in the Geras HaTshuva, it talks a lot about being connected with a rope, right? But that is all in what the soul has to do, right? Now, there's some very deep levels of what the soul has to do. So, in other words, kares cuts off the soul in a very painful. It's not something to downplay, right? It's a terrible thing where the soul is separated from God in all revealed ways, and there's this terrible rift in this connection. But nevertheless, ultimately, a Jewish soul that connection cannot be sullied and cannot be severed, because the soul is literally a piece of God. Now, a different way of saying this, yet another way of saying this is, God is immediate to the Jew. God is immediate, and I mean the literal definition of immediate, right? What does immediate mean? If you break the word down in English, immediate comes from the same word as medium, right? Or media, right? A medium is the means through which you communicate with someone, right? So I'm talking to you, the medium is the air. The air carries my communication to you, right? Immediate means the two things are connected directly. There's no middle, there's no intermediary. That's what immediate means. Immediate means there's no intermediary here, right? The animal soul to relate to God, there have to be intermediaries, right? For example, the seichel, the intellect, or the idea of God can be an intermediary between the soul itself and godliness, for example. Right? The godly soul, at its deepest and most true point, is immediate to God. There is no separation, right? What does it mean that the soul can be a piece of God? What does it mean there's a piece? We keep asking, right? We're building towards an answer. God is not a soul. God transcends all definition, including being defined as a soul. In Chassidus. In Chassidus, literally, there is no word in any language that you can say describes or does not describe God. That's how Chassidus is how radical Chassidus is about God. God is not a soul by any definition of soul. So how can a soul be a piece of God? Right? I'm making the question worse, not better.
No, God is an ocean, maybe the drops of the ocean of souls.
No, but it's supposed to be simple.
God doesn't have pieces, right? God doesn't separate into drops.
So a drop,
metaphysically.
Is the drop really not the ocean? Is it really separate?
Yeah, I like the metaphor. But what does it mean that the soul is a soul, though? Because the soul, even the truth is, it's not like water that you've just separated out a drop of water, because it seems that by something is changing in its nature. even as you're saying it's a part of God. You understand? Because God is not a soul, right? It's attaining some kind of new nature, right? But that new nature somehow doesn't prevent it from being a piece of God. Or, to put it slightly differently, in the way the commentaries on the Tanya explain it, in a more rigorous, to really begin to understand this concept, they put it like this. When you say the soul is a piece of God, you're saying two opposite things simultaneously. This language is a paradoxical language. Davar ve'efuche. You're saying a thing and its opposite with the same word. How? Because on the one hand, a piece of something implies that it shares the same nature. On the other hand, a piece of something implies that you've broken it off. It's become separate, right? So it implies at the same time absolute unity and absolute separation, right? The metaphor that I don't even know where the original source of the metaphor is, because it's in all the commentaries on Tanya. So I guess you just pick the oldest one and say that rabbi was the source. But the metaphor that's used in all of the commentaries on Tanya is like slicing an apple. That's the metaphor, right? Which is not so different from drops in the ocean, by the way. That an apple, when you cut it into little slices, right, there is no slice of the apple that's any less apple than every piece of the apple, right? Very similar to drops of the ocean. That's what it means, a piece, right? But on the other hand, that's the aspect where the piece retains the nature of what it was cut out of, that each piece is equally apple. But on the other hand, it becomes a soul. So it's not exactly like a slice of the apple. That's way too literal, right? The problem is the metaphor is limited. The metaphor can't apply, right? It's too literal to believe that God is broken up into pieces. First of all, it doesn't make any sense metaphysically. And second of all, a soul is not what a piece of God would look like, so to speak, right? A soul is a soul. It's something else. So the Rebbe Rayatz, the Frierdiker Rebbe, explains like this. He says, the Rebbe Rayatz says that who the soul is remains godliness, but what the soul is becomes separate. Again, who the soul is remains godliness, the mohus of the
How do you separate the who from the what?
It's a brilliant question. Who the soul is remains godliness, even as it's broken off into your individual godly soul. But what the soul is becomes separate. The Alter Rebbe puts it like this in a very famous language, which I was very delighted to read it again today, because I had forgotten about it for many years. But I read it today in the commentaries preparing this class. The Alter Rebbe told his chassid, Moshe Vilenker, a famous thing. He said, what's the godly soul? The godly soul, the Alter Rebbe says, I'm translating from the Yiddish. It's who is burning up in excitement at this, that God clearly exists, and beside God, nothing else exists, and this excitement is Him. That's the Alter Rebbe's description of the godly soul, right? He says in Yiddish, it's that the soul is excited as elokus, as Gott, I think, is faran, and was is nit Gott is klal nit faran, which means that God exists and that what is not God clearly does not exist. That God clearly exists and what is not God exists. And this excitement at this recognition, this excitation at this recognition, that is what the godly soul is.
Okay.
That's how the Alter Rebbe describes this, that's where I get my much abridged and simplified version that the godly soul is God saying I am. Right? Which is a different way of saying the same thing, in my opinion, or trying an attempt to say different.
The statement is very relatable.
Yes, it is, absolutely. Because it's explained as an experience, right? But you have to parse it, right? The godly soul is excited. Here's the difficulty. Really, we haven't erased the difficulty. We've just hidden it, right? Here's the difficulty. The difficulty is that the soul is the thing whose very identity is being excited that nothing other than God possibly exists, right? So there's no thing, right? Because only God exists.
Is it excited or murgash? Feels.
Mitlahev.
Mitlahev. He doesn't say margesh, murgash.
He doesn't say either. He says something in Yiddish, but it probably says verkocht in Yiddish.
Well, that doesn't help.
Doesn't help you. Mitlahev in Hebrew. He's excited. He's excited.
Because mirgash is felt and excited at the same time.
I don't think so.
No, in Hebrew.
Oh no, I understand, but I don't think that's the correct translation. I think the correct translation is mitlahev.
Okay.
So in other words, the soul, as it's split off from God, profoundly recognizes and knows God in an immediate way. And yet, it is not God. It's something else. It's a part that's broken off, right? So you see the difficulty here. You see why this is a tricky subject that we're going to try and unpack.
It sounds like an intellect trying to conceive the inconceivable.
Well, yes, but we do that a lot in this class, or we will. So that shouldn't stop us. But yes. The soul is the divine I am. The soul is God saying, I am into the world, right? So you see both aspects. What it is purely God's representation. But on the other hand, it's speech. It separates from God. It becomes separate from Him, right? Similar idea. A metaphor, a different metaphor, maybe a better metaphor, a more profound metaphor. And the truth is, we may need to return to it next week and explain it better. A more profound metaphor, I think, than the slicing of the apple, I found in a very long and very complex and challenging, I don't know what you even call it, essay on the first line of the second chapter of Tanya by Zern Rabbi from our generation. He says the metaphor, which is based on many, many other Hasidic discourses, he says the metaphor is like a son to a father, right, is really the metaphor. That the godly soul is like God's son, which the truth is, he has very good basis, because that's going to be the metaphor as we go later into chapter 2. We're going to talk about the metaphor of the son from the father, right? But he means it in a very specific way. He means it that he means it like this. He heightens this contradiction, this paradox in the understanding of the godly soul, right? How does he heighten it? Because he says like this. He says, the entire idea of the son in Chassidus, right? That there's a father and a son, right? The son, when the son reaches full maturity and becomes like his father, right? The son and the father are exactly the same. In other words, as Chassidus describes, the son and the father, the son in his maturity is no longer a receiver from his father, right? You think of the son and the father, that the son, the father's giving, and the son receives his very being and his very essence from his father, right? The father gives forth this very son's very being and essence, right? However, as you can see, and as Chassidus explains, when the father gives forth to create the son, it's what's called a hamshacha atzmis, right? It's a drawing forth of the very self. The self is replicated, right? Which means like this: the son can do everything that the father can do, right? He has his own complete intellect. He has his own complete emotions in the same form as his parent, right? And in maturity, he even has the ability to create sons of his own, right? In other words, there is no capacity that's in the father. Even the capacity that brings forth the son, that doesn't go on to be replicated and exist in the son, right? So there is a point where a son and a father is a description in Chassidus of separation, right? But it's paradoxical separation, because although the son becomes separate from the father and a totally independent being, right? Not like a student and a teacher. Student and a teacher is a different example, right? A student and a teacher, the student doesn't get his being from the teacher on the one hand, right? On the other hand, the student and the teacher are inherently in a giver and receiver relationship. Inherently, right? They're inherently in this relationship. As long as you're the student, you're the receiver. As long as you're the teacher, you're the giver. Your relationship is defined in one direction, right? Or the direction, the valence of this relationship is defined. The way they relate to each other is defined. The Son and the Father, because one becomes the copy of the other, right? That directionality disappears, right? There's no inherent the Son is always needing the Father is always needing the Son. They become like equals in a sense, right? Because their very being is the same, right? On the other hand, even as the Son becomes totally separate from the Father, his relationship with his Father is much closer than the student to the teacher. To the extent that, as explained elsewhere in Chassidus, the Son would have literal Mesiras Nefesh. He would give his entire life and his entire being for the sake of his Father, right? Which in Chassidus means, is code for, is shorthand for. We'll discuss that concept later, but that means that essentially they're of one etzem, they're of one self. The Son, paradoxically, as he becomes the separate being, fully expresses that he's one self with his Father, right? And what's the proof? The proof is try and separate them, right? Try and get between a son and their father, right? And say that whatever it is, right? Say that I should be more important to you than your father, or whatever it is, right? Can't get between them, right? When the relationship is revealed, right? Unless something is very wrong, you can't get between them. And on the contrary, the total closeness and identity of Son and Father is not as revealed when the Son is not yet fully mature and exactly like his Father. When the Son is younger, the Father is inherently in the position of the giver, and the Son inherently in the position of the receiver, so their connection is only that rational connection, right? It's specifically when the Son becomes a replica and becomes totally separate and independent of his Father, right, that ironically the two become bound absolutely close to the extent of identity. It's not even a relationship, it's a shared self, right? As we always say in Chassidus, bra kara da'avua. The Son is the thigh of his Father. That's the description. And he's literally an extension there of one being, right? So this is the metaphor that this rabbi gives. The godly soul is like that, right? The godly soul is like that. And really, there's depth to this. There's a whole Kabbalistic explanation of this. It's very profound. It has to do with the etzem of the kalim in the world of Atzilus, just terms that we would need 5 classes just to define the sentence before we could even discuss it, right? The Son, the whole idea is that, we'll discuss this more next week, God willing. I have a whole... We'll probably end up doing a whole class just on this, probably. But we'll have some other interesting things in there as well for people who are not who are not following me 100%. But the idea in shorthand is like this, that we're going to discuss more, is like this. The godly soul is separate from God. The entire point is that it becomes separate from God. If it didn't become separate from God, God wouldn't need it. God would do whatever it is the godly soul is doing himself. Which is in general a big question that we'll ask in next week's class, God willing, which is, why even have a godly soul? Just do it yourself, God. This is very bizarre. Why are you making parts of yourself and then sending them down into this world, right? If whatever it is you want, you could just do yourself, right? So if the godly soul, the whole point is the godly soul has to become separate. That's the whole point, right? If it doesn't become separate, God would just do it himself. So it has to be separate. But as it becomes separate, in its separation, in it being a part of God, as in a part that was broken off, right? In that itself, in that broken off from God, the being broken off itself is God in the most profound way. It is God. It shares one self with God, right? The very fact that it's separate from Him is the very fact that it's absolutely one with Him at the same time. Right?
So what happens when you die? Does it go back to him, or does it just disappear?
It definitely doesn't just disappear, but I object to the phrasing of the question. But I object to the phrasing in a question of a way that I don't have time to explain. So we'll have to leave that one. We'll have to leave the afterlife for a different time.
Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson.
But the question is, if it's so godly, how come it has such a big fight with the white? If it's God, the Nefesh Elokit is God.
It's not God. It's a piece of God. You're saying, how can the animal soul be so powerful over it?
Yeah.
This we will also explain. That's a good question. But the basic fundamentals is that, which is what we're going to talk about next week. The real question for next week is, why should there be a godly soul at all, right? If you're telling me that it's literally a piece of God and that it's saying, it's God saying I am, right? So why doesn't he just say it? What's this? Why as a soul? Why this setup? Why as a soul of a Jew, as an embodied soul? What is this whole concept? What do you need it for, right? What's it accomplishing, right?
You need things to choose from.
Why do you
If
even?
we
Why?
only have one reality.
Why?
That's the way it was created.
Oh, everything is that's the way. I could say that too.
That's true.
Why not have a choice between God, and the animal soul?
Because
No, he could make it that way. He could have made it that way.
yes.
Yeah. So the question is, why didn't he make it that way? Why did he make it the way he made it? Why do you need something that separates from God, right? To be the thing that you choose between, as you would put it, right? So the that's what we're going to discuss as we move forward. What's the deeper explanation of the word mamash, of the word literally? We said the simple explanation of the word literally, a piece of God above, literally. The simple explanation is, Alter Rebbe is telling you, he's not exaggerating. He really means it, right? But there's also more profound interpretations, a couple of which are, one way of saying literally is that literality means, if you say something is literally true, in a sense, what you're saying is that it's true at every level you could speak of it. Right. So in other words, in one sense, what you're saying is that God, the piece of God, remains a piece of God, even as it comes to the lowest place, right? Which is very nice because the root of the word mamash is like mamashos, right? Is tangibility, tangible, physical, the lowest physical
Mashesh, right.
reality. The sense of touch comes from the same root, right? So the when you say literally, you mean we're not just talking about the soul as it's somewhere else, right? We mean no, the actual as you have it in this world where you can hit the table, right? In this very place, the soul is a piece of God. The Rebbe Rashab famously told his son, we'll finish with this, the Rebbe Rashab famously told the Frierdiker Rebbe, his son, as quoted in the talks of the Frierdiker Rebbe, that mimal and mamash are two opposites, right? When you say it's God above, literally, above and literally are two opposites, right? So in other words, the godly soul reaches from mimal, which is atika kadisha, as the Rebbe Rashab says, from the highest expressions of godliness, all the way down to the lowest place. The soul is what it is in every place, which, by the way, is a different way of saying it's true. That's what truth means. Truth means the same everywhere that it goes. We will continue on these very abstract and subtle topics on the nature of the divine soul and try and explain this all much better, God willing, next week.
So, a question.